Infrastructure Committee meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. We have a quorum present. Next up is Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next up, we have public comment. We have two people that have registered before the meeting. When you come up, make sure to address the chair with your comments. We'll provide 3 minutes to each person. First up, we have Dean Beck. If you could approach the microphone, provide us with your name and address.
Hi, I'm Dean Beck. My address is 171902 Glenview Road, Anawa, Wisconsin, 54408. I am Town of Easton's chairman. I addressed this group the last time this large assembly, it was called a large assembly thing at that point. I still have some concerns because of, and I realize right now we have nothing. So anything could go on. The sound part of it, the wording in here is carry unreasonably beyond enclosed boundaries of a location or of the assembly. The next part is you were supposed to notify everybody within a half mile of where this event's going to happen. Well, I'm going to tell you my phone's going to be ringing off the hook. We had some experience with this with having the Q to Z Expo over the years. Thankfully, new owner. We just set some different hours in that. But my biggest concern from my point of view is for our town, the lack of input from the town in this permitting process. Seeing we're going to be the ones impacted by it. I, by state law, have to provide public safety, fire, EMS service. Nothing in here shows that there has to be a contract or anything with anybody. We have no retail in our township. I understand by reading this, they're looking for the revenue coming in to the county from a large event. For the town of Easton, it would be purely burden on my taxpayers, burden on their right to quietness and that type of stuff. And I am not opposed to large events. I am really not. I attend the Edgar Steam Show. I believe it could be done, but I would really like to see a lot more town, not that we get the 5-day thing after you issue the permit. I think it would be nice to have the towns included in it, because I can tell you as a town chairman, I feel like we are the, I'll call it the ugly stepchild to the county. The rural areas with the small populations, we pay taxes in like everybody else does. But when push comes to shove, we don't quite have the power that the county does as far as legally. And I feel the pressure from that. And it's my phone that rings when this stuff goes on. And I got to have answers. So that's my main concerns. Public safety, cost of my town, pressure on my volunteer fire department and EMS, and just trying to keep it all going. So some input from us would be greatly appreciated in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Gene Schultz.
Afternoon, Jean Schultz, 1006 Washington Street, Marathon, 54448. Good afternoon. I am Jean Schultz, representing the Partnership for Progressive Agriculture. We are a 501c3 with a mission to educate, promote, and advocate for a diverse and sustainable agriculture. PPA is here today to provide education and insight into the impacts of the updates to the Assembly Ordinance 12.04 that we'll have on our major event, our June Dairy Breakfast, and nonprofits. Our largest event is our annual June Dairy Breakfast, held at different dairy farms to promote agriculture and invite the community to tour and spotlight a local farm. In the past 13 years, June Dairy Breakfast has hosted over 33,000 people promoting agriculture and our local community. We truly value many aspects of the ordinance. For example, the mandatory coordination with the Sheriff's Department, Highway Department, and Health Department and other safety and evacuation plans, as we either have had previous concerns with our breakfast locations with traffic and parking, and greatly appreciate additional in-depth conversations with some county departments. However, as a volunteer organization with one part-time employee who just quit today, the administrative burden of the proposed revisions are substantial to an organization of our size. We reviewed and researched the proposed ordinance. Of the 40 tasks that the ordinance requires that need to either be addressed or researched, including reviewing the ordinance, addressing all items, and completing the application, we estimate it would take close to 75 hours for one person to complete, not including the collaboration time with our vendors, Host Farm, and our June Dairy Breakfast Committee. This is over tripling the current hours we spend on the 8 areas we have currently identified to host successful events on our farms. We are an experienced organization with multiple years of experience running the June Dairy Breakfast. I appreciate your time for today to learn more about the additional responsibilities that this ordinance change would be for organizations such as PPA. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anybody else wishing to provide public comment? Hearing and seeing none, we'll close public comment and move on to item 4, approval of November 7th, 2024 Infrastructure Committee meeting minutes. What is your pleasure?
Motion.
We have a motion from Hardinger. We have a second from Jensen. Any further questions or comments? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the November 7th, 2024 Infrastructure Committee meeting minutes signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed? We have a unanimous approval for our November 7th, 2024 meeting minutes. Moving on to item 5, policy issues discussion, potential committee determination. We have none today. Which brings us to item 6, operational functions required by statute, ordinance, resolution, or policy. We have nothing listed under A for discussion and possible action by infrastructure. 6B, discussion and possible action by infrastructure to forward to county board for consideration. B1 is CCITC, intergovernmental agreement, operating agreement. Turn it over to Director Klein.
Thank you. As you guys know, the City County IT Commission is owned by the City of Wausau, Marathon County, and North Central Healthcare. It has been under an intergovernmental agreement for quite some time. The last time it was updated was in 2021. Lance and Kurt are your representatives on the board, and recently, back in September and October, we went through it and identified some things that were not consistent with what we actually were currently doing. And so we went through and, on request from the board, I went through and cleaned it up. There was a couple of things that just hadn't been updated, where changes had happened to staffing and the like. And in front of you is a new intergovernmental agreement. We've removed the Schedule A, which was really a long time continuing to evolve list of changes to it. We updated it with the changes that I just talked about, and it references an operating agreement which had one change in it, and then also attached, which is at the end of this, if you would scroll down, David, is a summary of the changes. They are relatively mundane, as far as I could say. Lance, you're the board chair. Do you want to add anything about any feedback on this?
Sure. I'll just add that we actually went over these with you a couple meetings ago, and we just didn't have the information in the packet. So nothing on here should be a surprise. A lot of it, like Jerry said, is just housekeeping, changing titles, clarifying how CCIT, quite honestly, has always operated, how the commission has operated. But the summary is in front of you right now. And this does need to go to the full board for ultimate approval.
Move to approve and move on to the full board.
We have a motion by Supervisor Gisselman, second by Hardinger. Any further questions or comments? Hearing none, all those in favor of the CCITC Intergovernmental Agreement, Operating Agreement, signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? We have unanimous approval for 6B2 or 6B1 CCITC Intergovernmental Agreement Operating Agreement, which moves us on to 6B2 Marathon County's Assembly Ordinance. I will turn it over to Director Misgivens.
Thank you, Chair. So I know this meeting's brief, and we have given the presentation before that is in your packet. We gave it in the spring, so I'll just give the highlights and then open it up for questions because I'm sure there are some questions. But as a reminder, so we do have 12.04 in our code of ordinances right now, but as it exists, it's not enforceable. So it was put to the administrator to form a work group that consisted of members from public safety, infrastructure, and ERC to look over 12.04 and see if we could bring forward a new draft to the county board to consider for replacing in the code of ordinances. We've been meeting periodically for the last year and a half. During that time, we did engage the Steam Show, the Balloon Fest, the Dairy Breakfast, and we also did multiple outreach points to the towns to try and get some input. A couple of the issues that came up repeatedly, and you heard in the public comment today as well, where there were some concerns with security requirements, what the appropriate threshold should be for when the ordinance would go into effect. A lot of questions about implementation, and also there was concern about when and how the towns could have input in the process as well. So the draft before you today is the draft that we believe tries to address most of these concerns. The ERC did take a look at this draft on Tuesday, and you'll see in your packet there are two markups in the draft. One is on page 2 of the 12.04 ordinance, where they did recommend taking the threshold from 3,000 to 5,000. And that was discussed at the work group over time as well. 3,000 was the original proposal because that was consistent with what the existing ordinance has in it. 5,000 was also discussed as a good idea for a starting threshold because it's consistent with state administrative code for the requirement to have mass casualty plans when you have a special event of 5,000 or more. Taking that threshold to 5,000 actually would not require the dairy breakfast to adhere to 12.04 because most of their events at this time are in the 2,000 to 3,000 range is what they're reporting. The other thing the ERC did was just clean up the language as it relates to parking. It was determined as we had it in there, it was a little too prescriptive and we needed to revise it to drive more towards the outcome of what we were looking for as opposed to what an applicant would exactly have to do. So those are the two changes in the draft that are in your packet today. The actions I think that the committee can consider are recommending it to go forward with the changes the ERC made. They could also recommend it go forward without the ERC changes, or they could also recommend it go forward without or with different changes as well. And you could also choose to do nothing. I'll turn it over to Administrator Leonard if you want to add anything else.
Very briefly, I think you heard in public comment about those two concerns. One about town input, and I think we've addressed that previously. That is ultimately one of the real challenges with large assemblies across any governmental entity is that, again, these are ordinances that need to comply with the First Amendment, and some of those things that, as Mr. Beck talked about, we're really in a place right now without a working ordinance that any and all assemblies with no ordinance would be permissive without governmental engagement. That said, I completely appreciate that there is a desire sometimes to have government have more of a role in regulation. This ordinance is very much so on the minimal end of regulation, and Corp Counsel Pierner just walked in and can answer those questions for you, but they really, again, need to be content neutral. And that's why this is an ordinance that has requirements relative to process, but not relative to content. And we don't want to set ourselves up as the county, or certainly a process whereby a town could incur that liability. But again, on the dairy breakfast side, those concerns that Ms. Schultz referenced should, as Director Miskimmons just referenced, really, that was the conversation at ERC. Those concerns, administrative concerns, are really abrogated now because they're not going to have to comply until they hit that 5,000 person threshold. This really does make the ordinance, as Lori said, very much in line with that kind of state of Wisconsin mass casualty planning threshold. It also really very clearly makes it those truly large assemblies, and I know the sheriff is here, and he referenced at the ERC meeting, you're talking about Farm Technology Days, the Balloon Fest, really large events that we want to make sure they have the requisite plans in place for those to take place. But ERC did move it forward, so like Lori said, you have a couple of options before you, but doing nothing, this still, if there's no action here, it still moves forward to the county board. I do think it would be helpful if you are considering it moving forward to provide some insight to staff whether or not you would have changes other than those what ERC moved forward, but ERC did make those 2 changes.
Thank you. I think looking at some of the changes that were presented and approved at ERC, I think those are some positive changes to the ordinance and make it a little bit easier to work with for some of our groups, as well as providing more appropriate language in terms of parking. Anybody on the committee have any questions, comments? Like to make a motion?
Question.
Supervisor Gisselman.
Would this committee then move with the 5,000 then? I mean, would that have to come out of this committee or as a recommendation as did the ERC? And I also have a question about I was reported in the media this morning with regard to the First Amendment. Is there some further questions with regard to, I'd like to hear if there's some issues with regard to or is this the reason why we're bringing it to begin with, as I guess that's how it was reported.
Sure. I'll answer your second question first, because that's right in my wheelhouse. The original reason a number of years ago that this conversation began was in looking at our existing special events ordinance, because this 12.04 already does exist in your code of ordinances, but that existing ordinance has some constitutional issues that have been addressed in other counties through litigation where those counties have had parts of their ordinances found unconstitutional because they infringe on free speech and freedom of assembly. And the idea there is this is a public safety ordinance. It's not a zoning ordinance. It's an ordinance exercising the county's authority to regulate in the area of public safety in unincorporated areas. And the way the ordinance was originally drafted, there were some specific requirements on the timeline for the application and some of the specifics as far as numbers that a court of appeals in Wisconsin found violated the Constitution, the First Amendment, because it irrationally and unnecessarily restricted individuals' rights of free speech and freedom of assembly. So those were the first things that got addressed when we reviewed our 12.04 was we got to fix those. No matter what any other decision that's made, those have to come out of the existing ordinance. If you're going to pass a new one, they can't have those in there. If you're going to repeal 12.04, then it gets rid of them. Those are so those pieces were addressed in the review, really in the initial review of 12.04. Some of the conversation we had at ERC on Tuesday was about some of the parking regulations, and one of the comments I made, which is probably what was reported on, was, you know, the more technical you get in this ordinance as far as we're going to require a 9-foot something involving the parking stalls, the more likely it is that that's probably an unreasonable infringement on someone's freedom of assembly. So if you don't say, hey, we're going to make you have these specific parking spaces, but you say you have to have a plan for parking of this large amount of people, that's more in line with the county's ability to regulate public safety related matters. So I hope that answers your second question. Your first question was on process, and I really think it's up to you what action the committee wants to take. If the committee wanted to forward this to the county board with those changes that were adopted by ERC, that's an appropriate motion. If you didn't like their changes, you could make a recommendation without those changes. The world is your oyster. Subject to Robert's rules, of course.
I would just like to hear what the board, with regard to the 3 versus the 5,000, with the recommendations of the ERC, is that, I would just like to hear what this committee would think about moving that.
I'm good with the recommendations from the ERC.
If Supervisor Hardinger, if you grab a microphone.
I was just going to say, I'm good with the recommendations from the ERC as it's presented.
Okay.
Same. I'd like to go with the
Supervisor Jensen?
5,000 number.
I'm generally in agreement. I think the 5,000 is the more appropriate number. So I would entertain a motion if we're at that point.
Okay, so I'll motion to recommend it to push to the board with the ERC changes.
We have a motion from Supervisor Hardinger to push. To approve the Marathon County Assembly's ordinance as approved by Environmental Resources Committee. We have a second by Supervisor Voll. Any further questions or comments? Hearing and seeing none, all those in favor of approving the Marathon County Assembly ordinance as recommended by the Environmental Resources Committee signify by saying aye. Aye. And those opposed? We have a unanimous approval for 6B2. We'll move on to 7, Educational Presentations Committee Discussions. 7A, CCIT Projects. Director Klein.
Thank you. That information, I think, I hope is in the packet. Waiting for him to scroll down through it. Yes. I wasn't planning on going over anything in particular, but I'm available if there's any questions on any projects. I can tell you that the 3 big projects that we have going on this year are 1, we'll be replacing our phone system. 2, we'll be helping 9 departments move into the Lakeview AB campus. And 3, we'll be working with a number of contractors to finish and get ready the Regional Forensic Science Center, which has a lot of technology gear in it. We have lots of other projects going on, but those are big ones.
Does anybody have any questions for Director Klein? Hearing and seeing nobody looking, thank you for your report. We're on to item 8, next meeting date and time, announcements and future agenda items. 7A, committee members are asked to bring ideas for future discussion. Anybody have anything on the top of their head? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 8B. Next meeting is Thursday, February 6, 2025 at 9 a.m. I'll note that I will be unavailable for that meeting, so I'll need to touch base with Vice Chair Dickinson to make sure that he is, and we'll check to make sure we've got a quorum. We don't need to make any changes to that. With that being said, item 9, up for adjournment, looking for a motion. We have a motion by Supervisor Jensen, second by Hardinger. All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. Aye. We are adjourned. It is 12:54. Thank you, everybody.
Fastest meeting I've ever had. You got a job, man. We require a stay for it. The next one at 1?
There you go.
I thought so, yeah.
So, let's.